Welcome back to Rugby from the Stands. So, 3 rounds of the Nations Championship have ended, and I thought, let's look at all of the different teams and maybe do a bit of a stat analysis across what we saw in those 3 weeks. On this slide is a summary of the results across each round. And the first thing that I want to see was the split between the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere. They played 18 games. The North won 9 and the South won 9. Then I looked at whether the two hemispheres actually play differently. And honestly, they don't. Possession, carries, passes, kicks, line breaks, tries, entries, tackle completion, it's all nearly identical. The South score a couple more points a game, 31.8 to 29.8. And that's about the only thing that separates them. Now, I'm pretty sure none of you really care about the North-South split. To be honest, neither do I. But I just thought it was interesting to look at across hemispheres. But it did get me thinking about how do we break down the story of rugby. I really wanted to understand what actually wins games. So a lot of people have asked me whether I have a stats background, whether I have a data science background. I actually don't. Most of this has been based off of pulling the data and then trying to make sense of it based on my love for the game and trying to make sense of it from a first principle standpoint, from a common sense standpoint. So I looked at the data set and I wanted to see which metrics have a direct correlation to winning games. And this data set is 616 team games worth of stats between 2021 and 2026. What I found was this. If you look at a relationship score of 0 to 1, 0 being no relationship at all to winning, and 1 being a perfect relationship to winning, or a 1-to-1 relationship, line breaks and 22-meter entries had the highest positive relationship or correlation to winning games. So as you can see, 0.76 and 0.71. Possession had less of a direct relationship, and territory had even less of a relationship. That was kind of interesting for me to note because territory almost has no impact on winning games. You can have very low territory throughout 80 minutes. You can be playing in your half most of the time, and it doesn't really seem to impact games being won or lost. Same with possession. So what actually matters is line breaks and 22-meter entries. So if you can enter your opposition's 22, you're good. And obviously with modern rugby, as you may have noticed when you're watching games, when you're in the opposition's red zone, you have a higher chance of converting those entries because the rules do favor the attacking team in there. You'll probably notice multiple penalties being given away by the defending team, and that usually leads to yellow cards and sometimes penalty tries. So it's really hard defending your own 22. So if you can generate more entries into the opposition 22, then you're probably in a better position to win games. Now, that's obviously easier said than done, of course. So if you were to break down rugby into first principles, how do we now increase 22-meter entries? And how do we increase line breaks? Rugby is a pretty simple game at the crux of it. When you're playing, you get the ball in your hands, and there's 3 things that you can basically do. 1, you can carry the ball. 2, you can pass the ball. And 3, you can kick the ball. Now, to carry and to pass, you've got to hold the ball, right? Which is another word for possession. When you kick the ball, you're basically giving away that possession. So those are essentially the 3 things you can do when the ball is given to you. Now, let's look at it again from first principle standpoints, right? You've got carries. Those carries turn into line breaks. You break the defense. Those line breaks and hopefully get you into the opposition 22. And from the 22, you want to score tries. Across our data set, the average number of line breaks per 100 carries is 5.4. The average number of entries into the opposition 22 per line break is 1.5. And the average number of 22-meter entries that convert to tries is 38%. So basically 4 out of 10 entries usually result in a try. Okay, so keep that in mind. because we're going to go back to these charts. And I know that this probably sounds like rugby's cool, but we really do need to wrap our heads around stats and try to understand the relationship between these stats and how games are played, and potentially how coaches actually think about using these stats, right? So as I mentioned before, when you've got the ball, you've got three choices. You can either carry, pass, or kick. Carrying and passing is basically a possession stat. If you look at teams that have higher possessions, they will invariably have higher carries and higher passes than the team that had lower possession, right? So I've put on this chart on the x-axis kicks per 100 rucks. And on the y-axis, we've got possession percentage. What I want to look at is, are you a team that likes to hold on to the ball more or less? If you hold the ball more, then you're placed higher on this graph. And secondly, are you someone who kicks the ball a lot? That basically tells us what style of game that you play. So if you're looking forward to the Greatest Rivals Tour, for example, this is clearly a clash of styles. You've got New Zealand, who are a high possession, low kicking team, versus South Africa, who hold the ball below the average, so less than 50% possession, and they kick the ball quite a bit. And these are kicks per 100 rucks, so obviously the numbers are relatively higher than what you would see on a per game basis. But you can see that South Africa are the second highest kicking team, and New Zealand are the second lowest, second only to Scotland. So it's going to be really interesting to see how they go. So fine, you've got the ball, but it's no good having the ball and not going forward, right? If you have the ball and you're going backwards or you're going side to side and not gaining any ground, that's not good. So are you going forward in the right part of the pitch? And that's what we're trying to get at on this chart, right? On the x-axis, you can see meters per carry. That's measured from the moment you get given the ball until the moment you go to ground, okay? And on the y-axis, you got post-contact meters per carry, which only starts counting the moment a defender makes contact with you. So if you're a first five and the halfback passes the ball to you, those 2 or 3 meters that you run before anyone touches you, those are in your meters per carry numbers, but not in your post-contact meters number. Post-contact is once a defender hits you for the first time. How many more meters can you make after that first contact? Which means you don't go to ground easily. You're getting more go-forward ball. So if you look at this chart, South Africa and England clearly are teams that have high post-contact meters and high meters per carry. New Zealand are in the bottom left quadrant. Wales are obviously the worst here. They really didn't get any go-forward ball, and they were clearly being throttled by their opponents. And here on the right, you can see that New Zealand obviously have the highest number of carries per game. But every time they carried, the meters each person made were relatively low compared to South Africa, who have 111.7 carries per game. But whenever they do carry, they get you 4 meters every single carry. Compare that to New Zealand, who are just over 3 meters. So every carry is 1 meter less than South Africa. Now, it's not a bad thing, to be honest. It's a different style of play. If you have a pod of forwards and you do tip passes, you've literally got 1, 2, or 3 passes before someone tackles you. So it's not a bad thing to have lots of passes and lots of carries. It just means that New Zealand and Ireland are trying to get the ball to the edge, change the point of attack, whereas South Africa and England are much more direct. France, interestingly, they don't have a lot of post-contact meters per carry, but they do have a lot of average meters per carry. So that to me indicates that France are a team that finds gaps relatively easier than any other team. And it also tells me that in the Nations Championship, they've not been a team that's very physical, but they've been managing to find lots of holes in the opposition defense. Okay, now all these meters per carry hopefully get you in to the opposition 22. And here what we're trying to figure out is how often do you visit the opposition's red zone, and what share of those entries do you convert into a try? So again, you want to be in this top right quadrant. New Zealand, England, South Africa, and you can also add France and Scotland. They're up in that area as well, which is efficient in getting into the 22, and they're clinical in converting those entries into tries. South Africa are clearly number one in terms of ability to enter opposition 22 and also convert those entries. Australia are incredible at converting. So 3 out of 4 times they enter the opposition 22, they come away with a try. The only problem is they don't get as many entries as a team like France, Scotland, South Africa, or New Zealand. So New Zealand on average are between 10 and 11 entries per game. South Africa are 11 and above. France and Scotland also around 11 and above. Australia have 3 less entries, but they're far more clinical when they do get in there. So now let's flip it. We've looked at attack. Now let's look at the opposite, defense. When they've got the ball, and by they, I mean the opposition, are you good enough at stopping them from entering your red zone? And when they do enter, are you good at preventing them from converting into tries? Now, clearly, South Africa are excellent at starving you from entering their 22, and they're also incredible at preventing teams from scoring once they do get in. So on this chart, you want to be in the bottom left, this area. South Africa are the best at defending their 22. New Zealand are second best. They don't allow as many entries either. So South Africa allow about 7 entries, New Zealand about 8 on average. Scotland is the interesting outlier on this chart. Scotland don't allow many 22-meter entries into their red zone at all. But when the opposition does get in, 7 out of 10 times they go away with a try. France, something similar. More than half the time the opposition enters the French 22, they end up scoring. Fiji and Italy, again, they're in the quadrant you don't want to be in. They allow a lot of entries into their own 22, and they also allow the opposition to convert those entries into tries. Wales, on the other hand, they allow the opposition to enter their 22 a lot, but surprisingly, the conversion rate is relatively low. So they do try and defend. You could say that the Welsh are incredibly valiant in defending their 22. But you really want to be where South Africa and New Zealand are at. So again, before the Greatest Rivals Tour, it's going to be interesting to see the two teams with relatively the best 22-meter red zone defense going up against each other. But South Africa are on a different level, I'd say. Very, very stingy at giving away points. They make it very, very hard to score. And that's also down to their incredible scramble defense as well. Now, again, looking at defense, are you more of a blitz type of defense or do you have more of a drift defense? Now, this is a bit of a proxy inference. I don't know if that's the actual statistical terminology for it, but I hope that makes sense to you. I'm trying to infer from the data whether a team is more blitz or more drift. And some teams might actually have a mix of both, a hybrid. The assumption that we are making is that in a blitz defense, you're trying to shut the attacking team down before it gets the ball out wide. So you're stopping them from getting a lot of passes away. And that's exactly how this is measured. The number of opposition passes allowed per tackle made. So a lower number means you must be going up really, really fast. And you're not really allowing the opposition to get as many passes and phases away. And on the flip side, if you allow more passes before you tackle, then you're probably more of a drift system. Now, there's a caveat I need to share. If a team intentionally doesn't want to pass and they want to play 10-man rugby, and all they do is just take the ball and kick, then the stats might make their opponent look blitzy, even when they aren't. Having said that, when you look back at the kicking chart, let's go back to the kicking chart. Yeah. When you look at the kicking chart, nobody here was really kicking at the sort of numbers and volumes that would distort this. So I'm fairly confident with this read. Let's go back. So anything in between, like Ireland, like Italy, Argentina, or Wales, Fiji, and you could add New Zealand in there as well, you could say that they are more of a hybrid. Whereas you can clearly see that England, they are really blitz. They are under 0.9 opposition passes per tackle, which means even before a pass is made, they've tackled you. They fly through. And you can also see the tackle completion numbers. England have one of the worst, which is another side effect of a blitz system. South Africa are on the average for tackle completion, which is pretty good. So if you have a blitz style defense, but also a high tackle completion rate, then you're shutting down the opposition and making life very, very difficult for the opposition. Scotland, the same. Relatively blitz and also a very high success rate. New Zealand are kind of in the middle, more towards a drift, but the tackle completion rate is one of the highest. So it's very hard to break New Zealand's defense, which is pretty cool. Now, a lot of people saw how impressive New Zealand's defense was against Ireland. And my assumption was that New Zealand had a little bit more of a Blitz-esque defense compared to the first two games. So I did go and check, and the numbers actually say the opposite. Against France, they were at 1.02, against Italy, 1.08, and against Ireland, 1.27. So on this measure, they actually set off more against Ireland, not less. Now, the caveat is Ireland passed the ball 216 times in that game, which is a lot of passes. So some of that is just Ireland playing a wide game rather than New Zealand dropping off. But it's a good reminder that what I felt watching it and what the numbers say aren't always the same thing. Now, this is an interesting view in terms of when these teams tend to score. The game is 80 minutes. We split it into 4 quarters. And across each quarter, how many points do these teams on average score? South Africa are the only team that score quite highly at both ends. 15 points on average in the first quarter, which means they're scoring either 3 unconverted tries or more than 2 converted tries. And they finish with 15 again in the last quarter. If you notice, none of the other teams have that profile. They start strong and they end very, very strong. Interestingly, South Africa have a second quarter lull in 2026. Now, conversely, you look at New Zealand. This year, the highest number of points came in the third quarter, which is good because last year under Razor, they basically had a third quarter lull. But still in 2026, even under Dave Rennie, they do seem to have a bit of a drop-off in that last quarter. They only scored on average 6 points in the 3 games. And that's the same even against Ireland. The last quarter wasn't that amazing. Then you've got the front-loaded teams. Australia score almost all of their points in the first half. And then they just give up in the second half is what it looks like. France starts strong in both halves, in the first quarter and in the third. And then the ones that build. Scotland are interesting. They build towards almost like a crescendo at the end. They don't really start strong, but then they get into the game. And in the last quarter is when they really come alive. England peak in the second quarter and also end pretty strong. Argentina, Ireland, and Wales don't have a specific peak. And then at the bottom, Japan start really strong and then score 1 point on average in the last quarter, meaning a single penalty in the last 20 minutes across their 3 games. Italy, they haven't scored a single point in the last quarter across 3 games, and nor did Fiji. This next chart, I wouldn't call it boring stuff, to be fair. Especially if you're South African, you'd probably take umbrage to someone calling this boring. But what I mean is in terms of the platform. When you're restarting a game with set piece, whether it's scrums or lineouts, how good are you at this? And also at conceding penalties. And again, adding caveats, this isn't 100% foolproof because here we're looking at scrum wins percentage on your own put in. Same with lineouts. So if you've got the throw in, what percentage of your throws are you successful at? Now in scrums, it's rare that you don't get the ball back on your own feed. But if that's happening, like England here on 85.7%, that's not great. It's worse than Wales actually. So if I was England's scrum coach, I'd probably give myself an uppercut. Most teams are operating above 90%. Lineouts, I think, are a little bit more 50-50, even when you have the throw in, because it's contested. So here, Fiji and England actually have the most success, both at 96.3%, and New Zealand are the worst with 82.7%. So that's something Barnsley will have to have a look at and try and fix. South Africa have a much higher success rate with 93%. Line-out coaches, if you speak to them, they'll tell you that they want to see more than 90%, which is what they would consider a good day at the office. And when it comes to penalties conceded, Fiji are the worst offenders, and England a close second. Argentina, surprisingly, are actually the best, only 7.3 penalties conceded on average. Scotland, South Africa, and Italy are pretty good at staying clean as well. New Zealand are at 8.3. Again, you'd probably want that number to be slightly lower. Now, who are some of the standouts in terms of individuals who've been doing a lot of work? Joaquin Oviedo for Argentina had 61 carries across 3 games. That is insane. So he's been carrying basically 20 times a game. I don't even know who this player is, if I'm being totally honest. I haven't watched a lot of Argentinian games. So Argentinian fans, tell me about him in the comments. followed by Santi Carreras with 45 and Ben Earl on 45 as well. Now, if I had to pick the most dangerous man on the ball, that title would go to Manny Faye Waboso. And I'm not looking at most meters and most defenders beaten here. I'm looking at per carry. So every time you carry the ball, how many meters are you getting for your team? And how many defenders are you beating every single time you carry? Faye Woboso has 8.3 meters per carry. That is insane. And most defenders beaten, almost a defender on average every single time. Again, he is electric. He is dangerous. And when he's on song, there's no one who can stop him. He is outstanding. Most tackles, Ross Vincent, 72 tackles. Alex Coles and Jack Morgan, again, big shifts, 67 and 64. So they're tackling at more than 20 tackles per game. Ross Vincent is tackling at nearly 25 a game. That's a pretty big shift. Most turnovers won, Ben Gunter for Japan with 6. Ilya Kanakaivata for Fiji and R.D. Savea are both tied at 5. And then most tries, Will Jordan at 6, followed by Josh Canham and Matthew Jalibert. So we've got 12 teams and 12 different verdicts for each of them. Let's start with South Africa. Based off the data, they are the most dominant team. They've got the best defense, the best finishing, and they're dangerous in the first 20 minutes and also in the last 20 minutes. Nobody else is able to manage both those quarters as well as South Africa can. New Zealand, they carried more than anyone in this tournament. And I think it would be a bit harsh to say they went nowhere with it. I think it's just a matter of them getting more passes out wide. Hopefully, what that does is change the point of attack quickly, and it either gets you a gain line at the edge or it opens up gaps in the middle for you to go through. Now, I did go back and check the Irish game on this, and I'll be honest, the post-contact numbers actually went down, not up. 1.97 post-contact meters against France per carry, then 1.88 against Ireland, which is the lowest of the three. So that one's still to be fixed. What definitely did improve is the defense, and it improved a lot across the 3 games. Line breaks conceded went from 12 against France to 7 to 5 against Ireland. That's a pretty big shift. But a couple of warning signs, especially before going to South Africa, is the fact that they need to fix their line out, and they still can't score in that fourth quarter. And that's the exact point where South Africa scored more than any other team. Next, England. They're the most aggressive defense in the competition, the lowest opposition passes per tackle, but they also have one of the highest penalty counts conceded as well. And they average the most points in the second quarter out of all the teams. Next, France. They get you 4 meters every time they carry. They score 16 points between the 40 and 60-minute mark, so the third quarter, and then only 5 points in the last 20. Australia, they're actually the most clinical side whenever they enter the opposition 22. They just don't get many entries into the opposition 22. And they're pretty good at scoring in the first half, but they tend to go to sleep in the second. Scotland, they're a possession team, clearly. They kept the ball better than anyone else, and they also conceded the fewest entries and still leaked 70% every single time the opposition came into their red zone. Ireland, they've got the flattest profile in the competition. Quite unremarkable, you could say. That's a very blunt way of putting it, but they get basically the same number of points in every quarter, and there's nothing that really stands out in their stats. Argentina, they've got the most territory of the 12 and the second worst red zone defense. So they've got all that field position, but they're not able to protect their red zone. Japan, Ben Gunter pilfered the most ball of anyone, but they only scored 1 point on average in the last 20 minutes across 3 games. So they kind of start strong and then they fade away. Wales, 2.2 meters every time they carried, which is minuscule. They beat Fiji, then they allowed 78 points in 2 games, which from a defensive standpoint is not too great. Fiji, they're the team with the most turnovers won, but nothing to show for it, unfortunately. No points at all in the last 20 minutes. And lastly, Italy. 12 points a game, lowest of the 12. And they only scored 26% of the time that they got into the opposition 22. So the least lethal of the 12 teams. So there you have it, some highlights of how the 12 teams played in the Nations Championship. Let me know in the comments if there was anything that actually surprised you in the data, or if there's any other data you'd like to see. Do let me know, and we'll see if we can create it. And obviously, please do like and subscribe, people. It really helps us. It helps the channel. And please do share this video with anyone who enjoys this type of stat breakdown. Hopefully, I'll see you in the next one.